Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about the choices that Idaho faces as it moves forward into the new year, and specifically some education priorities. I know that the election has changed a lot of possibilities and actually strengthened some of the very needed reforms that were on the horizon. But what are some of the things that will be a high priority for Idaho legislators and likewise for Idaho citizens? I've got more to talk about coming up.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. So it's exciting. We've seen some interesting turns in the last few weeks, and I got to tell you, one of the more interesting ones that has come up just within recent memory is the one having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, for a lot of people, this is a sticking point because there's this assumption that, well, if it weren't for education, how would people know the proper ways to think, the proper attitudes, and so forth? But what it really is going to come down to, as you will see, is that really what education is for? Is it to indoctrinate us with the proper attitudes to make sure we all, think the same on pretty much the same issues? Or is it to encourage us to be better versions of ourselves and to increase our civic virtue and to basically help us become more self-sufficient, more self-sustaining? Because there are two very different worldviews, and you're going to see that in spades coming up here in just a moment. So the article here from thespokesman.com, Idaho Education Board will consider eliminating diversity offices from University of Idaho and other state colleges. Now, this has been a cause of quite a bit of hand-wringing, and there's a lot of angst and anxiety. Oh, but what are we going to do? Isn't diversity our strength? Isn't this, isn't basically scolding everybody and telling them what horrible racists they are, regardless of what their behavior is? Isn't that the way forward? Well, the voters seem to have spoken on this one, and I'm talking, in a very general sense, but it looks like a lot of people are kind of tired of being lectured by people who shriek incessantly about being victims and morally want to consider themselves superior to everybody else while calling them names. It's not a good look, and frankly, it's encouraged by this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion mindset. So let's take a look at this article from the Spokesman Review that gives us a little bit of insight into why this discussion is taking place now. So the Idaho State Board of Education will be considering a resolution this week to eliminate diversity and equity offices from universities. The board's draft resolution, which will be taken up in a special meeting today, states institutions shall ensure that no central office, policy, procedure, or initiative is dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, if it's passed, it's possible the resolution could scrap diversity offices from Boise State University, University of Idaho, Idaho State University, and Lewis Clark State College, according to the agenda for November 21st. Fingers crossed. I really hope that they come through. Colleges like University of Idaho have other centers that collaborate and function under their diversity and equity office. Now, listen to the names of these centers. And this is not to suggest that, well, they couldn't possibly do anything good. But the thing is, can they do this good not on the taxpayer's dime and without creating deeper divisions in society? So you've got the Women's Center, which educates students on abusive relationships. No denying there are some of them that take place, but do we default that everybody is in an abusive relationship based on, whether it's a man? Do we still have these terms, man, women, that kind of thing? See, it's all kind of up in the air under the whole diversity, equity, inclusion mindset. Also, safe sex, pregnancy, communication, and more. Like I said, there could be some good here, but there's also some ripe, fertile ground for leftist indoctrination, and that is apparently what it's been used for without any hesitation in times past. The Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Black and African American Cultural Center, and the College Assistant Migrant Program, which provides a supplemental scholarship, academic help, mentorship, and other support services, is also under the Diversity and Equity Office. And the big question that they ask here, and this is, I thought, what was so telling is, so if we do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion, what's going to take its place? And it reminds me of, You know what Ron Paul said back when someone says, "Well, if you get rid of the IRS, what are you going to replace it with?" And his answer was, "I don't know. When you take out a tumor, what do you replace it with?" Not everything and not every government program, especially diversity, equity, inclusion, is a benefit. Yes, it's beneficial if you want to indoctrinate large numbers of impressionable young minds into leftist talking points. But as far as educating them and helping them become, self-sustaining, free-thinking individuals who are capable of handling freedom, yeah, it's not such a great look. So it's concerning to those who want to support these programs, but Idaho's accreditors don't require colleges to maintain diversity offices, the proposal says, and the board wants to ensure that all students succeed regardless of personal identity characteristics. So this is kind of a stake through the heart of identity politics, which is actually a good thing. They want to ensure that success programs are dedicated to all students. The resolution says no college employee should be required to state their gender pronouns in any form of communication. Okay, I don't see anything there to disagree with. The idea here being that identity politics, no matter how it's dressed up, is it's just trying to make everything fair. It is a form of collectivism, just as racism is a form of collectivism, which lumps everybody in based on their group identity, skin color, religion, whatever it may be. It doesn't allow people to succeed on their own merits and on their own individual characteristics. And for some reason, that is just intolerable to people pushing that leftist agenda. The resolution will be considered a month after the first meeting of a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force formed in the Idaho legislature following a year-long national debate about taxpayer-funded diversity and inclusion programs. Now, this year, Idaho Governor Brad Little signed a bill banning higher education institutions from including diversity statements in their hiring processes. And there was one other aspect here that I thought was worth mentioning, and that is they won't require people to give their pronouns either. See, it's just, it starts with good intentions, but it turns into, what can you safely say or think? And that's just kind of how leftism spreads, kind of like a mind virus. So it leads us to the question, what do we want to see in terms of education? Samuel Lair has a wonderful piece. This is at idahofreedom.org, how Idaho can be at the forefront of an educational renaissance. Now, this may seem lofty to some people, but I want you to hear what he has to say, because he's talking about classical education, why we have education in the first place as opposed to indoctrination. Samuel writes, the education establishment fails to understand the true purpose of education in a republic, which is to create citizens capable of self-government. Do you get that? Creating citizens capable of self-government, not creating people who feel the right feels and think the right thoughts and never ever stray from whatever the dogma of the moment is. Now, Samuel says, undoubtedly a core feature of self-government is economic self-reliance, which our founding fathers called the virtues of industry and frugality. However, a stark difference exists between creating self-reliant citizens and workforce development, which is more or less what we're seeing education morphing into. One that recognizes that frugality and industry are simply two characteristics of a moral and religious people, and the other reduces citizenship to participation in the global economy. Samuel writes, the purpose of educational freedom isn't simply to produce schools that cost less to maintain and get better test results. He says, our public schools are failing because their underlying educational philosophy is inherently flawed. If all school choice accomplished is the creation of privatized versions of the status quo, well, they would fail too. We don't just need new schools, we need an entirely different approach towards education. Therefore, the goal of educational freedom is to provide real alternatives in the education sector and spur the development of superior institutions with different academic cultures, curriculums, methods of instruction, and metrics of success than are currently found in our public schools. So as it stands, Samuel writes, the education establishment is divided into two camps. One side has been captured by a radical subversive ideology that seeks to undermine our nation's fundamental values by indoctrinating our children with the tenets of critical theory, more commonly known as cultural Marxism. The other side wants to put their head in the sand and pretend that the only problem with our education system is the need to realign instruction with the demands of the global economy. Put simply, one is in the business of indoctrination, the other in the business of workforce development. So check out the distinction here. He says, increasingly, a new generation of educators, parents, and students understands the gravity of our current moment, inspiring a growing interest in classical education. Now, in stark contrast to the workforce development model, classical education focuses on developing the whole person by cultivating intellectual and moral virtue. To this end, classical education instructs students in foundational knowledge through engagement with a content-rich course of study rooted in the great intellectual tradition of Western civilization, from geometric proofs of Euclid to the tragedies of Shakespeare. What? You're saying it's as simple as reading old books? Well, not just reading them, studying them, learning them, examining, what they have to offer. And Samuel says all Idaho must do to be at the forefront of this renaissance is stop subjecting millions in public funds to the arbitrary whim of whatever bureaucrat decides what careers are in demand and have the government step aside. No, allow the money to follow the student. Let the parents decide whether they would rather their children identify Idaho's role in the global economy or develop good moral character and civic virtue. It's a world of difference, but if you want to see a people who are capable of handling freedom, solving their own problems, being able to think through and identify the correct, underlying principles and the problems that need to be solved instead of just swatting at symptoms, classical education is how that's done. Now, I have one other thing I wanted to share with you, and this is if you were a person who was not really on board with the whole mask mandates back when that was a thing, I want you to go to citizensallianceidaho.org and sign their petition. This is the time to put some pressure on the legislature and make sure that they ban mask mandates in Idaho. The whole purpose here is to prevent the state of Idaho, a political subdivision, or any officer of the state from mandating the usage of a face mask, face shield, or other face covering for the purpose of preventing or slowing the spread of a contagious or infection disease. Well, does that mean they're in favor of disease? No. It just means we stop substituting state force for people being able to make up their own minds. Trust me, you give us enough good information, not just some control-driven agenda, people will make the right choices. But to force it, that didn't work out so good last time. And frankly, we don't want to see that kind of thing happen again. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.